I thought the candle on the cake was lit for my birthday. I didn't realize my own parents were using it to burn down my entire inheritance while I was smiling at them. They didn't want my joy. They wanted my signature. That cold evening at the restaurant still burns in my memory. I hope you're all having a peaceful day. How is the weather where you are? Please hit like and let me know in the comments. I'm Elena, and this is how I finally stopped being their victim. Sign the damn papers, Elena. We do not have all night for you to play the victim while your sister is out there actually building a future for this family. My father's voice sliced through the elegant ambiance of Canoe like a rusted blade, loud enough to make the couple at the next table glance over before quickly looking away. He didn't even look at me. He was too busy checking his gold watch, his face etched with a restless, patronizing irritation that felt like a slap. I sat there in my deep emerald silk dress, the one I had saved specifically for tonight because I foolishly believed 32 was a milestone my parents might finally choose to celebrate. I had spent the entire morning in my lab, my back aching from leaning over a 16th century map, imagining this dinner would be the moment the distance between us finally closed. I thought there would be a cake, perhaps a toast to my recent preservation award, or at the very least, a simple, happy birthday. Instead, there was only this heavy white linen tablecloth and a stack of legal documents that smelled of fresh toner and betrayal. Beside him, my mother adjusted her pearls, her eyes darting toward the door as if she were expecting Serafina to walk in at any moment and rescue her from the discomfort of my presence. She didn't offer a smile or a gentle word. She only pushed the documents an inch closer to my wine glass, her silence serving as a cold endorsement of my father's cruelty. You've spent years playing with your little hobby, Elena, fussing over scrap paper and old ink while we footed the bill for your education, my father continued, his tone dripping with a condescension that made my blood run cold. He called my life's work, the meticulous restoration of our family's history, a hobby. To him, the archive wasn't a legacy. It was just data assets that could be liquidated to save Serafina's failing AI startup from the consequences of her own arrogance. He spoke about her vision and innovation as if she were a goddess, while I was merely the daughter who lived in the workshop, a relic of a past he was eager to sell to the highest bidder. I practiced what I call the silence of the abyss, keeping my face a mask of quiet compliance while my mind cataloged every insult, every dismissal, and every sharp word. I didn't interrupt his lecture about family duty or his claims that Serafina was the only one who truly understood how to create real value in the 21st century. He spoke as if I were a child who couldn't understand the complexities of finance, assuming that because I valued history, I was too naive to recognize a trap. "This is an opportunity, Elena," he said, leaning forward, his eyes narrowing. "We are naming you Director of the Vance Heritage Foundation. It's a title you haven't earned, but we're giving it to you anyway so you can facilitate the transfer of the archive to Serafina's firm." He pushed a heavy fountain pen toward me, its gold nib glinting under the restaurant lights like a predator's tooth. He wasn't asking. He was commanding, his patience for my sentimentality having clearly run dry before the appetizers even arrived. The weight of their combined expectations felt like lead in my chest. I looked at the papers, my hand trembling slightly as I reached for the pen, playing the role of the dutiful, defeated daughter they expected me to be. They wanted me to sign away the manuscripts my grandfather had spent his life protecting, the very documents that held the soul of our family, just so they could gamble it all on a sister who had never once stepped foot in the archive. I could feel my father's smug satisfaction radiating across the table, his belief that he had already won written in the arrogant curve of his lips. But as I pulled the final page toward me, my eyes, trained for years to find the smallest imperfections in ancient vellum, caught a tiny, whispered detail in the legalese. Deep within a clause labeled "Authorized Repair," there was a string of words involving unrestricted liquidation of physical assets that they never mentioned in their sales pitch. My heart hammered against my ribs, but I didn't look up. I realized then that they weren't just asking for my help. They were trying to erase me entirely. The debt my father spoke of was real, but in that moment, I realized it was a debt I no longer intended to pay in the way they expected. I set the fountain pen down on the white linen tablecloth, the gold nib pointing away from the documents like a discarded weapon. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the distant clinking of crystal from the other tables and the rhythmic ticking of my father's expensive watch. I didn't look up immediately. Instead, I kept my eyes fixed on that tiny, predatory clause, the one that would allow them to liquidate every parchment, every map, and every memory my grandfather had entrusted to me. My father's hand, weathered but still powerful, reached across the table and tapped the paper impatiently. "Well, the ink isn't going to find the page on its own, Elena," he said, his voice dropping an octave into that dangerous, low register he used when his authority was questioned. I looked at him then, practicing the silence of the abyss, letting my gaze settle on his face until he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. I wasn't being difficult. I was being an observer, recording the exact moment the mask of parental concern finally shattered to reveal the cold engine of greed underneath. "I'm not signing this, Father," I said, my voice steady despite the hammer of my heart against my ribs. The reaction was instantaneous. My father didn't just get angry. He became a different person, his face contorting into a mask of pure, unadulterated disdain. He didn't ask why, and he didn't offer to explain the unrestricted liquidation clause I had just found. Instead, he launched a verbal assault designed to strip away every ounce of my professional dignity. "You are such a disappointment," he spat, his words loud enough to make my mother flinch beside him. "You've spent 15 years playing house in that dusty workshop, coddling scrap paper and rotting vellum like they're holy relics. Do you have any idea how much money we've wasted on your little preservation career? You're a glorified janitor for dead men's trash, Elena, and you have the audacity to sit here and stall when your sister is actually trying to save this family's name." The insults continued, each one sharper than the last, as he painted a picture of my life that was unrecognizable to me. He spoke of Serafina as if she were the second coming of the American dream, a visionary whose artificial intelligence company was the only thing standing between the Vance name and total irrelevance. "Serafina is the future of this family," he shouted, leaning so far over the table that I could see the broken capillaries in his eyes. "She deals in data, in algorithms, in things that actually move the needle in the real world. You're a footnote, a relic of a past that we are done paying for. You owe us, Elena. You know this family every cent of your education and every square foot of that workshop you've occupied for far too long." My mother remained silent, her eyes focused on her wineglass. Her refusal to defend me hurting more than any of my father's barked insults. She was a collaborator in this betrayal, waiting for me to sacrifice my soul so she could keep her social standing. I sat through the storm, absorbing every word, every sneer, and every lie. I didn't cry, and I didn't shout back, because I knew that in this moment, his arrogance was his greatest weakness. He truly believed I was the naive daughter he had always treated me as, someone too focused on the past to understand the cold mathematics of the present. He thought he could bully me into submission because he believed my work had no value. I watched him realize that I wasn't moving, his face turning a deep, mottled red as he realized his intimidation wasn't working. "Fine," he hissed, throwing his napkin onto the table with a violent flick of his wrist. "If you won't be a part of the solution, you're just an obstacle to be cleared away. Don't expect another cent from us, and don't expect to keep that workshop for long. We own that building, Elena, and we will take back what is ours one way or another." I stood up slowly, the silk of my emerald dress rustling like a warning. I didn't reach for my purse or look at the untouched birthday dinner that now sat like a cold corpse between us. I looked at my mother, who still couldn't meet my eye, and then at my father, whose breathing was heavy with unspent rage. I felt a strange sense of clarity, a cold, hard peace that comes when you finally see the monsters for exactly what they are. I leaned down, my face inches from his, and spoke with a calmness that seemed to unnerve him more than any scream ever could. "I've listened to everything you've said tonight, Father. I've heard exactly what you think of me and what you think of my work," I said, my voice a whisper that carried across the table like a winter wind. "You mentioned a debt I owe to this family. You're right. There is a debt here. But you've miscalculated who owes what to whom. I will consider this debt very carefully." I turned and walked out of the restaurant, leaving the unsigned documents and the wreckage of my family behind me, the cool night air of the city already beginning to wash away the scent of their betrayal. The cold, biting air of the city night felt like a mercy compared to the suffocating atmosphere of the restaurant. But it wasn't until I turned the heavy brass key in the lock of my workshop that I finally felt I could breathe again. This space, which my father had so casually dismissed as a dusty hobby, was my cathedral, a sanctuary where the frantic pace of the modern world slowed down to the steady, rhythmic pulse of history. I didn't turn on the overhead lights. Instead, I navigated by the soft amber glow of my desk lamps, casting long, dancing shadows across the rows of specialized tools. The precision scalpels, the smooth bone folders, and the fine-tipped brushes that had become extensions of my own hands. The air here was thick with the comforting, earthy scent of beeswax, linseed oil, and the dry, vanilla-sweet aroma of old paper, a smell that always brought back the vivid image of my grandfather, Silas. He was the only one who had truly understood the weight of the past, the only one who didn't look at a crumbling ledger and see a liability, but rather a voice crying out from the silence to be heard. I sat at my workbench, my fingers tracing the scarred wood where I had spent countless nights working until the sun crept through the high windows, my eyes straining under the magnifying glass to save a single line of ink. While Serafina was being whisked away to prestigious coding camps and tech galas, her every minor achievement celebrated with champagne and expensive gifts. I was here, in the shadows, quietly investing my life into the preservation of a legacy my parents were now so eager to sell. They saw my dedication as a lack of ambition, but I saw it as a sacred trust, a life investment that couldn't be measured in quarterly earnings or stock options. I remembered the times I had stayed behind to monitor the humidity levels of a 16th century map while the rest of the family went on lavish vacations, my only company being the quiet crackle of the parchment as it settled into its new life. I had sacrificed my social life, my sleep, and even my health to ensure that when the world eventually forgot who the Vances were, these documents would remain to tell the truth. The hypocrisy of my father's words burned in my chest. The idea that I owed them for the space I occupied, when I was the one who had kept the very foundation of their identity from rotting into oblivion. I looked around the room at the thousands of pages I had cleaned, deacidified, and reinforced, realizing that every hour of my labor had been a silent contribution to a family that didn't even care enough to remember my 32nd birthday. My hands, though stained with ink and calloused from years of delicate work, felt stronger than they ever had before. I wasn't just a restorer. I was a custodian of truth. And if my family wanted to treat our heritage like a commodity to be liquidated, they were going to find out exactly how much power resided in the scrap paper they so deeply despised. There was a profound sense of irony in their desire for data, failing to realize that the most important data wasn't found in Serafina's algorithms, but in the physical DNA of the documents they were trying to snatch away from me. As I moved to the back of the studio to clear my mind, my foot brushed against a cardboard box tucked under a stack of old shipping crates, a box my parents had left by the curb for the trash collectors just last week, claiming it was nothing but clutter from the attic. I had rescued it on a whim, too tired to look through it then, but now, fueled by a cold, clarifying anger, I pulled it into the light. It was a heavy, nondescript container, its edges softened by years of neglect and dampness. But as I pried back the tape, the familiar scent of my grandfather's tobacco hit me like a physical blow. Inside, buried under old tax returns and faded photographs, lay a leather-bound folio wrapped in oilcloth, something that looked far older and more significant than anything my father would have recognized. My professional intuition flared, the professional language of my craft telling me that I was looking at a piece of the puzzle my parents didn't even know was missing. I carefully lifted the folio, the weight of it promising a different kind of justice, one that would be written in the very ink they had tried to erase. The morning sun felt like an interrogation light as it spilled through the high windows of my workshop, exposing every grain of dust and every microscopic fiber of the manuscripts I lived to protect. I hadn't slept, my eyes burning from the glow of the desk lamp and the weight of the folio I had rescued from my parents' trash just hours ago. I reached for my phone, a habit I usually loathed, and my heart stopped when I saw the headline on the national newsfeed. Vance Tech AI decodes the unbreakable. Serafina Vance solves the century-old cryptic manuscript. My stomach churned as I scrolled through the images. There she was, Serafina, standing in front of a sleek 50-inch monitor in her glass-walled office, her face radiating the same manufactured brilliance my father had praised at dinner. But it wasn't the AI's sleek interface that caught my eye. It was the high-resolution scan on the screen behind her. It was the exact page of the national treasure I had been working on for 6 months. The 14th century document currently sitting under a protective shroud on my very own workbench. The betrayal didn't just hurt. It felt like a physical violation. A cold blade slid between my ribs by the people who were supposed to be my sanctuary. I remembered my mother's surprise visit last week, how she had insisted on bringing me an organic green juice and lingered near my desk while I was in the back room retrieving more distilled water. I remembered her asking how the little papers were doing, with that feigned maternal interest that I had mistaken for a peace offering. I saw the subtle angle of the manuscript in the news photo now, a perspective that could only have been captured by someone standing exactly where she had been, a smartphone camera hidden in the palm of her hand. She hadn't come to check on her daughter. She had come to harvest data for the favorite child, treating my life's work like a field of crops to be pillaged. Before I could even process the depth of her deception, my desk phone shrieked, the sound jarring in the quiet of the morning. It was the head curator from the National Museum, his voice devoid of the professional respect we had spent 10 years building. He didn't ask questions. He issued a cold, calculated threat to terminate my contract immediately, accusing me of leaking sensitive, high-security historical assets to a private firm for corporate profit. He spoke about legal ramifications and breach of ethics, his words falling like stones into the silence of my workshop. He told me that because Vance Tech had solved the mystery I was hired to restore, my services were no longer required, and an investigation into my professional conduct would begin by noon. They were dismantling my reputation. The only thing my father couldn't buy and Serafina couldn't code, with a single, well-placed phone call. I sat in the heavy silence that followed the click of the hang-up, the walls of my workshop, the only home I had ever truly known, closing in on me. They weren't just taking the ancestral house and the family archive. They were ensuring I would never work in this industry again, turning me into a pariah in the world of historical preservation. I looked back at the news screen, at the decoded text Serafina was flaunting to the cameras of a dozen national networks. A bitter, jagged laugh escaped my throat, echoing off the high ceilings. My sister, in her desperate rush to save her failing company and her fragile ego, had relied on a machine that could see the ink but couldn't understand the soul of the paper. She had missed the watermark encryption, the master key hidden within the very fiber of the vellum that I had spent years learning to read with my eyes and my heart. She had presented a beautiful, logical lie to the world, a digital ghost of the truth, and my mother had been the one to hand her the brush to paint it. I realized then that my parents didn't just want the family's assets. They needed my absolute silence to make their fraud permanent, to ensure the world never knew that their golden child's innovation was built on a foundation of theft and technical incompetence. But as I looked at the ancient folio I had pulled from the trash, the one my grandfather had hidden away, I felt a shift in the atmosphere of the room. The director position they had offered me at dinner was a trap, a way to keep me under their thumb. But it was also a door they hadn't realized they'd left unlocked. If they wanted me to play the role of the obedient, disgraced daughter, I would play it to perfection until I was ready to pull the rug out from under their digital empire. My sister thought she held the key to the future, but she didn't realize that I was the only one who truly held the keys to the past. And I was finally ready to start turning them. I reached for my phone, my fingers steady now, the trembling from the restaurant a distant memory. I dialed my father's private line, the one he only answered for important business. When he picked up, his voice was a bark of impatience, but I softened mine, pitching it to the tone of a daughter who had finally been broken by the weight of her own insignificance. "Father," I whispered, injecting a slight tremor into my words. "I've spent the last few hours thinking about what you said at dinner, about my debt to this family. You were right. I was being selfish, clinging to old papers while Serafina is out there doing the real work." I could almost hear his smug smile through the receiver, the sound of a man who believed he had successfully bullied his way to another victory. I told him I wanted to make it right, that I would sign every single document he wanted, but I wanted to do it at my national award ceremony in Washington next week. I told him I wanted the whole world to see that the Vance family was united, that I was finally stepping into the role he had designed for me. He chuckled, a dry, hollow sound, and told me he was glad I had finally found my senses. He didn't even notice the cold, sharp edge behind my compliance. He was too busy celebrating the surrender of the daughter he never bothered to understand. Once I hung up, the mask dropped, and I returned to my workbench. My sister was playing with digital ghosts, but I was about to deal in the absolute reality of physical evidence. I spent the next several hours submerged in the professional language of my craft, a process that felt like ASMR for my frayed nerves. I began by using a soft goat hair brush to whisk away decades of attic dust from the leather folio I had rescued from the trash. My movements were surgical, my mind a invisible observer, as I prepared a gentle solution of ethanol and deionized water to soften the brittle adhesives. With a precision scalpel, I worked under the glow of my magnifying lamp, my breath shallow, as I peeled back the stained silk lining of the folio's inner cover. There, hidden behind a false back that only a master of restoration would think to look for, I found it. The codicil. It was a single sheet of heavy, cream-colored bond paper, dated only 2 years before my grandfather passed away. As I held it under the raking light, my heart skipped a beat. This wasn't just a legal amendment, it was a safeguard. It explicitly named me as the sole curator of the family archives, stipulating that no portion of the collection or the estate could be leveraged, sold, or modified without my express, notarized consent. But the truth came when I turned the page to the attached financial disclosures tucked behind the document. There, in black and white, was a mortgage application for the ancestral home, dated 4 months ago. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at the signature at the bottom. It was my name, written in a flowing, elegant script that looked almost exactly like mine. But the pressure of the pen was all wrong. It lacked the subtle hesitation of my natural stroke. It was a forgery, a desperate, clumsy attempt by my parents to borrow millions of dollars against a property they didn't actually have the right to encumber. They hadn't just been asking me to sign at dinner. They were trying to legalize a crime they had already committed. My father had stood in that restaurant and lectured me about debt, while he was secretly drowning in a hole he had dug for Serafina's vanity project. He was using my identity as collateral for his own failures. I wasn't just protecting a few old maps anymore. I was standing in the middle of a corporate crime scene disguised as a family crisis. I realized then that my parents' sudden generosity in offering me a director title was nothing more than a way to keep me quiet while they finished their heist. They assumed that because I spent my life in the past, I was too naive to understand the cold mathematics of the present. They were wrong. I carefully photographed the forged document with my high-resolution macro lens, the digital flash of my camera a silent promise of the storm to come. They thought they were using me as a pawn to save their failing empire, but they had forgotten that I was the one who knew how to read between the lines. I spent the rest of the night in the shadows of my workshop, not as a victim, but as a strategist, mapping out a path to a justice that would be as permanent as the ink on the pages I preserved. The workshop was silent, save for the low, rhythmic hum of the fume hood and the steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner, a sound that felt like the heartbeat of history itself. I moved with a cold, calculated precision, my fatigue replaced by a crystalline focus that only comes when the stakes are absolute. To my parents, this room was a graveyard of scrap paper, but tonight, it was a forensic laboratory where the past would finally hold the present accountable. I donned my nitrile gloves and adjusted the high-intensity ultraviolet lamp, casting a violet glow over the ancient contract I had rescued from the trash. In the world of restoration, the naked eye is a liar. It sees only the surface, the grime, and the wear. But under the professional language of specialized light, the hidden soul of a document begins to breathe. I watched as the fibers of the 18th century paper fluoresced, revealing the invisible topography of the vellum. Using a microspatula and a precise mixture of high-purity solvents, I began the delicate task of separating the layers of paper that had been fused together by decades of dampness and neglect. It was a slow, meditative process, a form of ASMR for the brain that settled my soul even as my anger hardened into a weapon. As the final layer of residue yielded to my steady hand, I held the original deed up to the raking light, and that is when I saw it. The watermark, a ghost in the ink that had remained silent for over 100 years. It was a specialized mark, a custom wire-form design used only by the most elite paper mills of the 19th century, and one that only a true restoration artisan would know how to identify. This wasn't just a decoration. It was a legal seal of intent. My heart hammered against my ribs as I read the rediscovered clause, the ink appearing as sharp and unforgiving as a judge's sentence. The document clearly stated that the Vance estate was a conserved entity, and that its status as a historical trust rendered it immune to any form of commercial mortgage or transfer of title without the explicit, written consent of the designated curator. My grandfather hadn't just left me a house. He had left me a fortress, built of ink and parchment, specifically designed to protect our legacy from the very greed that was currently consuming my father's heart. The irony of the situation settled over me with a terrifying calm that made me realize just how profound my parents' foolishness truly was. They had held this document in their hands and seen nothing but clutter, tossing away the very shield that could have saved them, all because they lacked the vision to see value in anything that wasn't a digital stock ticker. They were so blinded by the flashy promise of Serafina's AI empire that they had discarded a legal masterpiece that outweighed every algorithm my sister had ever written. My father had stood in that restaurant and called me a janitor for dead men's trash, never realizing that the trash he threw out contained the only power that could strip him of his unearned authority. He thought he was the master of finance, but he had failed to account for the one currency he couldn't manipulate: the truth of the archive. I was no longer the naive daughter they could manipulate with a fake title and a patronizing pat on the back. I was the curator, the legal guardian of everything they were trying to steal, and I finally held the curtain I needed to bring their house of cards crashing down. I carefully positioned my macro lens camera, capturing every detail of the watermark and the protective clause with a resolution that would leave no room for debate in a court of law. Each click of the shutter felt like a nail in the coffin of my parents' betrayal. Once the digital files were secured, I opened my encrypted email and attached the images, addressing them to a high-profile heritage lawyer in Washington, D.C., whom I had been quietly vetting for weeks. I included a brief clinical summary of the forged mortgage signatures and the illegal attempt to liquidate a conserved trust. I didn't write with malice. I wrote with the detached professionalism of a strategist who had already seen the end of the game. The debt my father was so fond of mentioning was about to be called in, but the interest was going to cost him everything. I looked out the window as the first gray light of dawn began to touch the city skyline, feeling a profound sense of what? The battle hadn't even officially begun, but as I watched the ink dry on my own notes, I knew that the past was finally ready to fight back. I stood before the heavy oak doors of the house that had once been my sanctuary, now a crime scene of the heart. The morning air was crisp, but the atmosphere inside the Vance estate was stifling, thick with the scent of expensive lilies and the oily residue of unearned success. I took a final, steadying breath, adjusting the strap of my bag, which contained the digital ghosts of their crimes, and stepped into the foyer. I could hear the rhythmic popping of a champagne cork from the parlor, a sharp, celebratory sound that echoed through the hallways where my grandfather used to tell me stories about the weight of history. As I walked into the room, I became the invisible observer, a role I had practiced for years in the silence of my workshop, watching but never truly seen. There they were, the three of them, huddled around a tablet screen like vultures around a fresh kill. Serafina was glowing, her face illuminated by the blue light of a valuation chart that showed her AI company's worth skyrocketing into the tens of millions of dollars. My mother was beaming, her hand resting on Serafina's shoulder with a pride she had never once directed toward me, while my father poured the golden liquid into crystal flutes with the practiced hand of a man who believed the world was finally back on its proper axis. They didn't notice me at first, and I allowed myself a moment of a bitter internal irony as I watched them toast to a future built on the very foundation I had saved from the trash. To them, I was just the daughter who had finally folded under the pressure of their superior financial logic. When my father finally looked up, his expression shifted from triumphant to wary, his eyes narrowing as if searching for a hidden blade. I didn't give him the satisfaction of seeing my anger. Instead, I lowered my gaze, softening my posture to match the image they had of me. I played the role of the master of camouflage to perfection, projecting a sense of quiet, defeated resignation. "I'm sorry for how I acted at the restaurant, Father," I said, my voice barely above a whisper, laced with a practiced tremor that made my mother's eyes soften with a condescending pity. "I've spent the last few days looking at the numbers, at what Serafina has achieved with the AI. I realize now that I was being stubborn. I was clinging to the past because I didn't think I had a place in the future." The tension in the room dissipated instantly, replaced by a smug, suffocating sense of vindication. My father set the bottle down and stepped toward me, his chest puffing out with the satisfaction of a conqueror. "It takes a big person to admit they're wrong, Elena," he said, his voice dripping with that patronizing tone I had grown to loathe. He didn't ask how I was doing after he had threatened my career and my home. He only cared that the obstacle was gone. I continued my performance, telling them exactly what they wanted to hear, that I would sign every document, every transfer, and every they required. I suggested we do it at the National Museum ceremony in Washington, D.C., where I was to receive my preservation award. "I want the whole world to see that our family is united," I told them, "and that the Vance legacy is moving into the 21st century with Serafina leading the way." Watching them exchange triumphant glances was like watching a group of gamblers celebrate a win while the house was already being foreclosed upon. Behind my submissive mask, I felt a profound sense of a liberation that came from knowing this was the last time I would ever allow them to believe they had power over me. I watched Serafina tap her glass against the tablet, her eyes already distant as she calculated how to spend the millions that didn't belong to her. She didn't realize that the data she had stolen was a ticking time bomb, and that the sister she had stepped over was the only one who knew how to defuse it. The irony was ASMR for the brain, a cold, intellectual satisfaction that sustained me as I accepted a glass of champagne I had no intention of drinking. I felt a strange sense of pity for them then. 3 people so consumed by the moan of digital wealth that they couldn't see the structural integrity of the truth was already collapsing around them. They were so sure they had won that they had forgotten to check the locks on the doors they had tried to kick me out of. As I prepared to leave, my father walked me to the door, his hand resting heavily on my shoulder in a gesture that was meant to be paternal but felt like a brand. For a moment, I saw a flicker of the man he used to be, before the greed had hollowed him out. But then he spoke, and the illusion vanished. He didn't say he loved me, and he didn't say he was proud of my award. He only looked at the luxury car in the driveway and then back at me with a cold, calculating smile. "That's my girl," he said, his voice rasping with a chilling satisfaction. "It took you 32 years, but you're finally starting to think about the money." I offered him a thin, enigmatic smile, the kind of smile he gives when they know a secret that is about to change everything. "Yes, Father," I replied, my voice steady as I stepped out into the morning light. "I am thinking about exactly what everything is worth." The silence of my hotel suite in Washington, District of Columbia, was a heavy, living thing, broken only by the distant, muffled hum of traffic far below on Pennsylvania Avenue. I sat by the window, the city lights reflecting off the glass like a million tiny diamonds scattered across a velvet cloth. But my focus was entirely on the leather-bound folio resting on the mahogany desk. It was the restored deed that I had spent years of my life and the last few sleepless nights perfecting. Under the soft glow of the desk lamp, the cream-colored bond paper seemed to radiate a quiet power, its watermark a secret promise of protection that my grandfather Silas had left specifically for me. This wasn't just a document anymore. It was my shield, my voice, and the final piece of a puzzle my parents were too arrogant to even realize was missing. I ran my fingers over the edge of the paper, feeling the familiar texture that my father had so cruelly dismissed as dead men's trash only 1 week ago. I remembered the venom in his voice at the restaurant, the way he had leaned across the table to tell me I lacked the financial sense to understand the real world. He had treated my 32nd birthday like an inconvenience, a small obstacle on the path to Serafina's digital empire. My mother's complicit silence, her eyes hungry for the status she thought my sacrifice would buy, stung more than any of my father's barked insults. They had called me a simpleton lost in the past, while they secretly forged my name to mortgage our history. The debt my father spoke of, the one he claimed I owed for my education, felt like a heavy chain I was finally ready to break. I wasn't just a daughter anymore. I was the curator, the legal guardian of a legacy they were prepared to feed into a machine for a temporary stock boost. I pulled my laptop toward me, the screen a harsh white contrast to the warm amber of the room. My original speech was there, a polite, standard address filled with social thank yous to my parents and platitudes about family support. With a single, deliberate stroke of the delete key, I watched those lies vanish into the digital void. In their place, I began to type the truth. Words that were as sharp and permanent as the ink I used in my workshop. I wrote about the living archive, the sanctity of heritage, and the crime of turning a family's soul into liquid assets. I didn't write with the heat of anger, but with the cold, deep-seated resolve that comes when you have nothing left to lose and everything to protect. My heart felt a pang of mournful regret for the parents I once wished I had, but it was quickly overshadowed by the absolute certainty that I was doing this for Silas, for the truth, and for my own survival. As I finished the final paragraph of my new speech, I closed the laptop and sat in the dark for a long time, my breathing slow and steady. Tomorrow, on national television, under the bright lights of the National Museum, the mask of the obedient daughter would finally fall away. My parents and Serafina would be in the front row, expecting a coronation for their greed, but they would find only a reckoning. I thought about the American dream they so loudly proclaimed, the idea that hard work and integrity meant something, and I realized they had long ago traded that dream for a hollow, digital imitation. I was the one who had stayed awake in the shadows, the one who had saved the papers they tried to throw away, and tomorrow, the world would see the true value of the janitor's work. I felt a profound sense of loneliness, a solitary figure standing at the edge of a cliff. But I also felt a strength I had never known I possessed. I reached out and touched the folio one last time before turning off the light, the darkness of the room feeling less like a cage and more like a cocoon. I was ready for the storm. The grand rotunda of the National Museum felt like a cathedral of light, the air humming with the quiet murmurs of 500 of the country's most influential historians, philanthropists, and legal minds. High above, the vaulted ceiling seemed to stretch toward the heavens, and for the first time in my life, I didn't feel small beneath it. I felt like I was finally at the correct scale. I stood in the wings, my emerald dress shimmering under the stage lights, clutching the leather folio that contained the truth my family had tried to bury in a dumpster. In the front row, I could see them. Arthur and Diane Vance, sitting with the practiced poise of American royalty, their faces masked with a paternal pride that was as artificial as the AI Serafina was currently using to build her house of cards. Serafina sat between them, her smartphone held high, ready to record the moment I signed away our heritage so she could post it to her millions of followers as a new era of innovation. They looked so smug, so utterly convinced that the daughter had finally been broken by the weight of her perceived debts. When the Master of Ceremonies called my name to receive the National Award for Historical Preservation, the applause was a deafening roar that seemed to freeze time. I walked to the mahogany podium, the click of my heels on the marble floor sounding like the rhythmic beat of a drum leading to a revolution. I looked out at the sea of faces, then down at my father, who offered me a sharp, commanding nod, a silent order to get on with the signing they had orchestrated. I didn't reach for the golden pen they had placed on the lectern. Instead, I opened my folio and pulled out the original restored deed of the Vance estate, the very one they had dismissed as scrap paper. I signaled to the technician in the booth, and suddenly, the massive 60-foot digital screen behind me flickered to life, displaying a high-resolution, ultraviolet scan of the document that made the entire room go silent. I was told recently that my work is merely the fussing of a janitor over dead men's trash. I began, my voice clear and resonant, carrying to the very back of the hall without a hint of the tremor I had feigned for days. I saw my father's smile falter, his eyes narrowing as he realized the script had changed. But history isn't trash, it is a fortress. And today I am here to show you the structural integrity of that fortress. I pointed to the screen, where hidden watermark of the 19th century paper mill was glowing with a ghostly, undeniable brilliance. I used the technical language I had mastered over 15 years, explaining to the shocked audience how this specific watermark was the legal seal of a conserved trust. I watched the blood drain from my father's face as I read the protective clause aloud, the words echoing through the museum like a judgment. This property is a sacred trust and cannot be mortgaged, sold, or transferred for commercial gain without the notarized consent of the designated curator. There was a cold, clean fire in my veins as I looked directly at my parents. I announced to the national television cameras and the room full of stunned investors that the mortgage my parents had recently taken out against the family home was, in fact, a fraudulent act, an illegal encumbrance on a property they never had the right to leverage. I saw the investors in the second row, the ones Serafina had been courting for her AI firm, lean back and begin to whisper urgently to their legal aides. I didn't stop there. I explained that the data Serafina's company was using to revolutionize history was stolen, incomplete, and fundamentally flawed because it lacked the master key hidden within the very fibers of the documents she had tried to digitize without understanding. I wasn't just a daughter refusing a request. I was a professional exposing an international fraud on a national stage. The silence in the room was absolute. The only thing that mattered was the truth projected in 40,000 pixel resolution behind me. I saw Serafina's hand drop, her phone lowering as the realization hit her that her viral moment was now a record of her own professional demise. My mother's hand went to her pearls, her face a mask of horror as the social standing she had spent a lifetime cultivating vanished in the span of 5 minutes. My father looked like he wanted to lunge at me, but he was trapped by the cameras and the hundreds of witnesses who now saw him not as a patriarch of the American dream, but as a man who had tried to rob his own daughter's future. I felt a profound sense of power, the kind that comes from knowing you are the only one in the room who truly understands the value of the ground you are standing on. I am the curator of the Vance legacy, I concluded, my voice dropping to a whisper that was more powerful than any shout. And as of this moment, the archive is closed to those who only wish to exploit it. I closed the folio with a firm, final click. The catharsis, I felt, was unlike anything I had ever experienced. A total, blissful release of 32 years of being overlooked and undervalued. As I walked off the stage, the room remained in a state of stunned paralysis, the sound of the first camera shutters clicking like a firing squad for my family's reputation. I had saved the past, and in so doing, I had finally secured my own future. The heavy velvet curtains had barely settled behind me before the air in the backstage corridor exploded with the heat of my father's fury. I hadn't even reached the green room when I heard the frantic, heavy rhythm of his footsteps echoing against the polished concrete. Arthur Vance, the man who had built a life on the illusion of absolute control, was now a portrait of unraveling desperation. He didn't see a daughter. He saw a threat that needed to be neutralized, his face a mottled shade of crimson as he cornered me near a stack of equipment trunks. "What have you done?" he hissed, his voice a jagged rasp that carried none of the polished authority he had displayed at the Canoe restaurant. "You've just destroyed 40 years of my work in 5 minutes of grandstanding. You think you're a hero? You're a traitor, Elena. You've bankrupted your sister and humiliated this family on national television. I will see to it that you never hold a piece of parchment again as long as you live." Beside him, my mother looked as though she had aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Her hands trembling so violently, she had to grip her clutch bag to keep from dropping it. She didn't offer a hug or a word of concern. She only looked at me with a cold, hollow betrayal. Her silence once again proving that her loyalty was reserved for the highest bidder. I stood my ground, practicing the silence of the abyss that had become my shield. I didn't flinch, and I didn't raise my voice. I looked at the man who had called my life's work dead men's trash, and saw only a small, frightened person clinging to the wreckage of a lie. "I didn't destroy anything, Father," I said, my voice a calm, steady contrast to his manic energy. "I simply restored the truth. You were the one who brought the matches to the house. I just refused to let you burn my grandfather's legacy to keep Serafina's ego warm." At that moment, Serafina herself stumbled into the corridor, her phone still clutched in her hand like a useless talisman. She looked at me with a venomous hatred, her voice shrill and desperate. "You're a liar! My AI is revolutionary! You're just jealous because I moved the family into the future while you stayed in a dusty basement." I didn't need to argue. I simply reached into my folio and pulled out a single printed document, the side-by-side comparison of her decoded text and the actual encrypted watermark she had completely missed. "Your AI didn't decode anything, Serafina," I said, my tone as clinical as a surgeon's. It simply hallucinated a logic based on the low-resolution photos Mom took for you. You presented a forgery to the National Museum, and in doing so, you've committed professional suicide. But more importantly, you've committed fraud. I watched the realization sink in, the smug mask of the visionary finally cracking to reveal the terrified girl underneath. Just as my father began to launch into another tirade about my unearned arrogance, the heavy double doors at the end of the hall swung open. The sound of polished Oxfords on the linoleum floor was rhythmic and final. I had spent weeks coordinating this moment, and seeing Detective Miller and the two representatives from the district attorney's office walk toward us was the ultimate catharsis. My father's eyes darted toward the exit, but the exit was blocked by the very reality he had tried to outrun. My lead attorney, Marcus Thorne, stepped forward and addressed my father with a voice that was as cold as a winter morning. "Mr. Vance, I suggest you stop speaking immediately. We have provided the authorities with the original deed and the forensic analysis of the forged signatures on the $3 million mortgage application for the Vance estate." The silence that followed was absolute, that felt like the ending of an era. I watched the handcuffs click around my father's wrists, a sound that was far more permanent than the popping of champagne corks at their house just days before. Serafina was being escorted out as well, her innovation now officially under investigation for data fraud and intellectual property theft. My mother stood alone in the hallway, a ghost of the woman she had once been, finally realizing that the daughter she had dismissed was the only one left standing in the light. I didn't feel the need to gloat, and I didn't feel the need to scream. I looked at my parents with a quiet, detached bow-dung, a mercy that comes from knowing the debt has finally been settled in full. I hadn't taken their money. I had simply taken back my identity. I walked past them, the scent of their desperation fading as I reached the heavy iron doors that led to the outside world. Stepping out into the cool, crisp night air of Washington, D.C., I took a long, deep breath of freedom. The lights of the capital city were bright, but for the first time in 32 years, they didn't feel blinding. Behind me, the museum was a chaotic storm of sirens and flashing lights, but in front of me, there was only the quiet, beautiful silence of a future I had finally earned for myself. 6 months have passed since the flashing lights of the police cruisers faded into the Washington night, and the silence that now fills the Vance ancestral home is no longer heavy with secrets, but light with the breath of history. The air in the grand hallway no longer smells of expensive lilies and the metallic tang of corporate desperation. Instead, it carries the comforting, honest aroma of beeswax, cedar, and the dry, sweet scent of aging parchment. I stand in the center of the newly christened Vance Archive and Living Museum, watching the morning sun spill across the polished hardwood floors in long, golden ribbons. This house is no longer a trophy for my father's ego or a digital data farm for my sister's vanity. It is a sanctuary, a place where the American dream is preserved in its truest form, not through shortcuts and algorithms, but through the meticulous, hard-earned labor of the hands. I spent the last several weeks opening the doors to students, historians, and neighbors, people who look at a 19th century ledger with the same reverence I do, seeing the humanity in every inkstroke. Justice, I've learned, doesn't always look like a gavel coming down. Sometimes it looks like a quiet morning where the only debt you owe is to your own integrity. My father and mother now live in a modest two-bedroom apartment on the other side of the city. Their world shrunk down to a scale they can finally afford. Serafina is working a standard administrative job in a tech firm that has nothing to do with artificial intelligence. Her revolutionary reputation, a ghost that haunts only her own social media archives. I did not cut them off entirely, for that is not who I am. Every month, I send a modest stipend to cover my parents' basic needs, an act of duty that comes with very clear, very firm boundaries. They are no longer the architects of my life, and they no longer have the power to forge my name or my future. I feel a quiet sense of pity for them, a distant pity for three people who were so blinded by the focus of unearned wealth that they threw away the only thing that was truly theirs. They traded a legacy for a lie, and in the end, the lie was all they had left. I walk toward my workbench, the place where I have spent 10,000 hours breathing life back into the forgotten. My tools are laid out in a precise, rhythmic order. The scalpels, the brushes, the distilled water, each one a testament to the fact that I am no longer an invisible observer in my own story. I sit down, the emerald silk of my dress replaced by my practical canvas apron, and I feel a profound sense of peace settle into my bones. I am the curator, not just of these papers, but of my own soul. I look at a new manuscript resting on the table, its edges curled like a secret waiting to be told. And I realize that the I made in these shadows was never about the money. It was about the truth. My grandfather, Silas, would have liked what I've done with the place. He would have recognized the steady hand and the sharp eye that saved his fortress from the fire. My work has finally mended the fractures in my own heart, leaving me with a strength that is as permanent as the ink on the pages before me. I am no longer the daughter who was not enough. I am the woman who was exactly what this legacy needed to survive. As I pick up my brush to begin the first layer of cleaning on a new piece of history, I realize that the weight I felt at that restaurant 6 months ago has vanished, replaced by the light of 1,000 mornings like this one. The past has been saved, the debt has been settled, and the future? Well, the future is finally mine to write, one careful line at a time. The past has been saved, and the future is only just beginning. Witnessing Elena's journey was like watching a fragile piece of parchment turn into a shield of steel. It's a reminder that being quiet doesn't mean being weak. Often, the ones who listen the most are the ones who know exactly where the cracks are. To my dear friends who are listening, your worth is not a number in a bank account or a title in a company. Your worth is the truth you carry. If you are being pressured to give up what defines you, remember Elena. You have the right to protect your legacy, your peace, and your identity. Setting boundaries with family isn't betrayal. It's a necessary act of survival. How do you feel about Elena's choice to support her parents financially despite their betrayal? Was she too kind, or was that the ultimate mark of her strength? What is the one thing in your life you would never trade for success? Please, tell me your stories in the comments. I'm here, listening to every word. God bless, and see you in our next story.